Hey everybody, this is Russ from Metro Game Core. I got the Anbernic RG476H in the mail yesterday, so let's do an impressions video. This is a handheld that looks strangely familiar, not just from Anbernic's own catalog, but from other manufacturers. It almost feels like a love child between the Retroid Pocket 2S with its 4x3 display and the kind of boxier layout, but then also the sleek and the full glass front that we have on the Retroid Pocket 5. You kind of combine them all together and we get something that looks a lot like the RG476H. And as I was playing around with it today, it kind of felt like a greatest hits compilation among all of the other retro-focused handhelds that we've seen over the years. There's nothing special or unique about it, but that's also kind of its charm because it sort of gets everything right. So this is not going to be a final review. We've got about a week until it actually launches, so I'm going to use that time to test it, and then I will do a review video next weekend. For now, we're going to talk about things like the controls and the ergonomics and any sort of deal breakers that I see right out the gate. And as a quick summary, I'm not seeing any deal breakers. This looks to be a very fantastic retro-focused handheld. There are a couple nitpicks here and there, mostly having to do with its form factor and overall shape, but overall I think this one's going to be a winner. So grab your favorite snack and drink, let's go ahead and get started. Okay, let's jump into the specs first, starting with the CPU. So this is the Unisoc T820 chipset. It's an 8-core CPU that we have seen in 5 other Anbernic releases over the years: the RG556, the RG Cube, the RG406H, 406V, and then finally the RG Slide, which came out earlier this year. So we've already got a pretty good idea of the performance here. It's going to be able to play all the retro systems upscaled up through Dreamcast and Nintendo 64, and you're going to be able to play a good amount of PS2 and GameCube, but not every single game. It's also got the standard 8GB of RAM and 128 gigs of storage that we often will see with these Anbernic Android-based handhelds, and of course it also has a microSD card slot if you want to expand that storage. We've also seen this display before. It's 4.7 inches diagonally with a resolution of 1280 by 960, an aspect ratio of 4:3, and it also runs at 120 Hz refresh rate. And the screen has been used twice before, first in the Anbernic RG Slide, which has the same chipset, but then also the RG477M, which is more powerful. And it's an excellent LCD panel. It's going to scale well for most of your retro systems, and then that 120 Hz refresh rate also gives you very fast response time. The battery size is also pretty standard for these Anbernic handhelds, 5,000 mAh. They say it's going to give you about 6 hours of battery life. I will leave battery life testing for my final review just because it takes some time. But one thing worth noting, this does not have super fast charging. It only goes up to 9 watts in my testing so far today. So this is not a device that's going to charge super quickly. And it weighs 298 grams or about 10.5 ounces. In terms of connectivity, we've got 5 GHz Wi-Fi and Bluetooth 5.0, and this can also give you video out via USB-C, but it can't charge at the same time that it gives you video out. We've seen that across the board with this chipset. The operating system is Android 13, and it's got a lot of other bells and whistles, including Hall sensor sticks and triggers, gyroscope, rumble, and a 3.5mm headphone jack. Now, we don't know the price just yet, but I'm expecting it to be around $160 like all the other devices with this chipset that we have seen previously. So that's kind of what you can consider right there. It's going to be cheaper than your Retroids and whatnot, but also a bit less performant. So let's take a look inside of the box, and this was a review unit sent over to me from Anbernic. But like with all my videos, they're not going to see this ahead of time, no money was exchanged in any way, and all opinions are my own. The box is relatively simple, and they're offering 3 different color options. We have the black that you can see on the front, then also one called Retro Gray, and then Indigo. That's the one that I have. Inside the box, there really isn't a lot going on. We've got the device itself that's covered in this little plastic film, and then also below that, we have our user manual and then a USB-C charging cable. And first impressions with the handheld is that it is surprisingly heavy. Like, it obviously is a plastic handheld, but it's nice and dense and chunky. Some of this additional weight probably comes from this all-glass front, and this is the first time that Anbernic has done this. In fact, many of the other companies have been doing it for a while, like Ioneo and AYN and Retroid, but it seems like Anbernic has finally jumped on as well. And I was surprised to find that this 298 grams actually makes it heavier than the Retroid Pocket 5 and only a little bit lighter than the metal RG477M. And so yes, it's certainly a hefty handheld. Its 4.7-inch display makes it rather large and tall, and then we have that glass front, and I think all that contributes to something that's a little bit heftier than you may be expecting. The other thing that really struck me about this handheld is that it kind of feels like a crossbreed between an Anbernic and Retroid handheld. We've got the D-pad and face buttons that feel very Anbernic, but then the overall design kind of feels like a little bit more of a squished Nintendo Switch Lite, which has always kind of been Retroid's design. And so, yeah, it's kind of a mix between the two. I don't think that's a bad thing, and I don't really care whether or not one company copies the other. It's really all about whether or not the handheld itself is good, and I think this looks pretty nice. I got a couple nitpicks about the overall design, like the select and start buttons being down here on the bottom. I would much rather have them up top like they are on the Switch Lite and a couple other Retroid devices. I find that to be just a lot more comfortable to be able to get into the menus. But otherwise, I think it's a pretty nice design. These shoulder buttons in particular have a nice flare to them. The back here is flat, but it feels pretty comfortable to hold, all things considered. Even though it is square, it's rounded in all the right places, and so when I push it against my palms, yeah, it feels like it fits nicely. On the back, I've been resting my middle finger against the bottom of the flared shoulders and triggers, and this has been a pretty good fit right here, and then I leave my index finger up top, and so plenty of space for my fingers on the back because this is a taller handheld. The glass front will go all the way to the edge and then just kind of drops off here at a 90-degree angle. It's a bit sharper than I would like, especially compared to the bottom, which is more rounded. And so you can definitely feel that edge as you're playing, but it wasn't really getting to the point where it was annoying, just something that I noticed. This is one of those things I'll have to just test over the next week and then kind of make a better assessment in my final review. But so far, it's something I've noticed, but it isn't really that bad. Overall, I like how thin and sleek it is. It doesn't have any big ergonomic bumps like the Retroid devices do, and so it feels more like a just casual fit, and I like this overall feeling. It's obviously a D-pad centric setup, and this feels the most comfortable, but we'll talk about how it feels with the analog sticks as well once we get to that section. Before that, I want to do a comparison in size against some other handhelds, both those that look similar in terms of design like the Retroid Pocket 2S, but then others that are of a similar size. So starting with the Retroid Pocket 2S, you can see there is a big difference between the two. That 3.5-inch display has always felt small, but compared to 4.7 inches, yeah, it's a world of difference. Another smaller device is the Retroid Pocket Mini version 2, and you can see that yes, this one also has a much smaller display. This one is not a 4:3 aspect ratio, it's 31:27, and it's 3.92 inches, but there's kind of a big difference between these as well. One that's kind of a similar size is the RG Slide. They have the same screen on them, but this one slides up and makes it quite a bit taller. But overall, it's kind of interesting since these have the same chipset, but a very different layout. And I think this one is a lot more comfortable to use because it's not so top heavy like the RG Slide. It's almost identical in size to the RG477M with those key differences, like the fact that this one's made out of plastic and also has those stacked shoulders as opposed to inline. And I find this one also to be more comfortable than the RG477M. I'll talk about this more in my final review, but I think that these actually do serve two different purposes, even though they are so similar. And so I don't really see this one as being a full-on replacement for the RG477M, because this one is so much more powerful. It's going to allow you to play PS2 and GameCube without breaking a sweat, and then also you'll be able to stack on heavy-duty shaders, which will enhance your retro gaming as well. So there are many things that this can do that the RG476H may not do as well. Moving on to devices that are larger, here's the Retroid Pocket 5, and this one is kind of just a different setup altogether. It's not quite as tall. It has the 16:9 aspect ratio display, which makes it better suited for certain types of games, and yeah, you can see it's also a bit wider too. I also think it's worth comparing to the Nintendo Switch Lite just because they have a very similar form factor, other than, obviously the D-pad and analog sticks are swapped between the two, but otherwise you can see that yes, this is quite a bit smaller than the Switch Lite. And then finally, of course, here it is compared to the Steam Deck. You may have heard of this thing before, but otherwise, yeah, you can see it's much smaller than these big handheld PCs too. So putting it all together, I don't think this is a small handheld, especially compared to the 3.5-inch display devices that Anbernic is known for making, but I do think that there are some trade-offs with having this larger size, including that larger screen, which again is impressively big. And depending on the pants and shorts that you're using and the size of its pockets, you might be able to cram it in, but this is at the cusp where I would not consider this to be pocketable. I wouldn't want to walk around with it. So it definitely falls in line with something that I would throw inside of a backpack or a sling bag and take around with me, but not necessarily in my pocket and walk around. Everybody's got a different definition of what makes pocketable, but that's just the way that I see it. It's big, but not too big for me. And overall, I love these 4.7-inch devices like the RG477M. We've just got so much screen to work with, and it makes all those retro games look really impressive. This device is going to be thicker than the RG477M because this one has those stacked shoulder buttons, but I think it's a good trade-off in terms of comfort and everything else. Another benefit of having a somewhat larger handheld is that we've got more space for our hands on the back, so this is a very comfortable experience. I've been enjoying it over the past day. I can definitely see this one becoming my main retro handheld with that bigger display and this extra comfort. It's just not the one that I would throw in my pocket if I'm just going to go and run an errand. Okay, let's talk about these controls. We'll start with the D-pad. So this is a typical Anbernic D-pad. It's a rubber membrane. It's got that classic Super Nintendo kind of look and feel to it. And yeah, it's got a good amount of travel to it, good pivot, everything that you would expect from this company after years of making this similar D-pad. And the D-pad and face buttons have this plastic circle here, so there's no glass there. So when you press down on it, you're not pressing against the glass, and so it feels kind of classic and retro in that way, even though we do have this sleek and somewhat smudgy glass on it as well. And when I test D-pads, I usually do the same game so that I'm consistent. And the first one is Contra. So I press down on the D-pad, then rock it left and right, both lightly and then with some extra force. When I move it lightly, the character doesn't really move. Every once in a while it will, so I would say it's a little bit more sensitive than I would like, but we're really getting nitpicky here. If I try to rock it even further left and right, I can make the character move, but that's a good thing. I want the ability to hit a diagonal. I just want to be able to avoid a false diagonal if I don't want them. So at least when it comes to my Contra test, I would say that it passes it pretty well, but it is a little bit more sensitive than I would like, just by a hair. When it comes to my Street Fighter style test, here I'm actually trying to hit a diagonal, rolling it into a Hadouken and Shoryuken, and absolutely no issue here whatsoever. It feels really good and very classic. I grew up learning how to play Super Nintendo Street Fighter 2, so this is like right in my wheelhouse. So I would consider this D-pad to be Hadoukenable and Shoryukenable, no problem. Another test I will do is with a precision platformer like Celeste, so here I'm trying to see whether or not I'm hitting a false diagonal when I don't want to, and so far no problems here whatsoever. So even though the D-pad is a little bit more sensitive on the Contra test, in actual practical use, like when playing in Celeste, I've got no problem here, so I think this is a good D-pad. Let's talk about the analog sticks next, and at first glance you might be thinking, oh no, these are Nintendo Switch Joy-Con sticks, but that's really just the design of the cap. The sticks underneath are those Hall sensor sticks that we've seen with other companies. They have a wide range of motion, so they are good. We've seen this over the past year or so from Anbernic, and the caps also come off, and so it has the exact same design as we've seen before. So you can swap out these caps with others. For example, those from Retroid or Neo or AYN, those are all going to fit. There also are 3D printed options too. So this is not really that big of a deal to me. I don't really like the look of this cap either, and I think it's a little bit slick, like I would like it to have a bit more grip to it, but that's an easy fix if you try out some of those other solutions from other companies or on Etsy. As far as analog stick accuracy, this is pretty good. I'm not detecting any cardinal snapping here. We've got a full range of motion, and I feel like I can move this in any direction that I please. So when playing an analog stick focused game like Super Mario 64, I feel like I have complete control of Mario. I can walk when I want to, I can run when I want to, and I can move in any direction without being inhibited by cardinal snapping. And in terms of position, I think it's okay when you're playing with a single analog stick. You can kind of shift your hand down a little bit to make it more comfortable for your thumb. So when playing something like an analog stick-centric game, Nintendo 64, PlayStation 1, or an arcade game, all this is going to feel pretty darn good. But like with other D-pad-centric devices, when you try to play with a dual stick setup, for example here with Destiny Rising, this is not a very comfortable setup because you have to really reach to be able to hit the shoulders and triggers and the thumbsticks at the same time, and I don't find it to be very comfortable. And we have seen this time and time again with these D-pad-centric designs. It's not necessarily a bad thing, it's just a matter of knowing which kind of games you're going to be playing and which device is going to be a better fit. And I would not personally want to play first-person shooter games on a design like this. So instead, the overall control layout here just seems perfectly suited for D-pad centric gaming. You know, when playing an old school NES or Super Nintendo game, it feels very natural, but when trying to do dual stick analog stuff, yeah, it's just not as great. Like with other Anbernic devices, the analog sticks do have RGB lights and you can adjust them in the settings. So you can turn them off, or you can change the different patterns or have them be like a solid color, whatever you would like. Personally, I like to turn them off. It gives it a more classic look for me, and that's what I prefer. So that's what I've personally been using. Below that, we've got the Anbernic RG button. This will bring up their front-end launcher if you press and hold it, but you can go into settings and change this out to be a different front end. So if you're using something like Beacon or Emulation Station, you can change that out in the settings. And so it is really handy to be able to jump in and out of your front end of choice with this button. This button right here is a home and back button. You tap on it, it's going to be back. You press and hold it, it's going to be home in the Android menu. Okay, now let's talk about these face buttons, and no surprises here, they are almost identical to every other button we've seen from Anbernic. They are rubber membrane, they have the glossy texture, which they've been using for years now, and they are nice and bouncy and feel relatively tactile too. So no complaints here, I think it's a good classic retro feeling button. Finally, on the bottom, we've got our select and start buttons, and that's about it on the front. Up top, we've got our power button, which will work as a sleep button in Android, our volume up and down, an LED charging indicator, and then the exhaust for our active cooling fan, which you can see here on the back. Now let's talk about the shoulders and triggers. The triggers are analog and they have a good amount of travel to them. I think they're nicely rounded. They are comfortable to use. I do kind of wish that they had like a texture right here, like a bumpy plastic, but otherwise I don't have any complaints about these either. They're relatively easy to press down on and they have a good range of motion. The shoulder buttons are easy to press down on, but I find them to be a little bit louder than I would like. They are by far the loudest buttons on this device. Let's do a sound test. We'll start with the shoulder buttons, then do the face buttons, and then finally the D-pad, and you'll see there's a big difference between all three. So yeah, I think there's no bones about it. The micro switches on the shoulder buttons are just a little bit too loud. I wish they were dampened and softened a little bit more. On the back, we've got, the Anbernic typical stamp and then also our active cooling fan. And on the bottom, we have our two down-firing stereo speakers, a micro SD card slot, USB-C port for charging and video out, and then also a 3.5mm headphone jack. The micro SD card slot is this little flap of plastic, and I have had a very hard time getting this thing to sit flush. It'll do it every once in a while, but it'll start poking out of the top right here. My guess is that this little piece of rubber that's kind of holding it in place is pushing up against something inside of the shell. And so that's why we're getting a little bit of bump here. We've seen that with other devices like from Retroid. And so unfortunately, I like that they have the little flap, but it is annoying when it doesn't actually sit flush. Overall, I think the hardware is good. I've got the same old nitpicks, like the select and start buttons being down here on the bottom, the micro switches on the shoulder buttons being a little bit too loud, and then also we've got this flap for the micro SD card, which really just doesn't stay shut. But I think if we're drilling that far into the nitpicks, that's an indication that everything else is pretty good, and the main stuff you're going to be using, like the controls themselves, are excellent. Now let's talk about this screen. I've discussed it a lot in my previous videos with this same display, but as a quick recap, it's 4:3 aspect ratio, 4.7 inches diagonally, and that resolution of 1280 by 960 will scale really well for a lot of retro systems. We'll do some testing here later. It's not an OLED panel, which means that it's not going to have those rich saturated colors compared to similar devices on the market, but it has its own advantages, like that 120 Hz refresh rate. A while back I did a video talking about black frame insertion and other tools that you can use to really enhance the overall look and feel of your display if you have 120 Hz and higher, and that's all going to apply to this handheld. In other videos, I've also demonstrated that this 120 Hz panel has lower input latency compared to 60 Hz panels, and that's going to be great when playing retro games. So overall, I think that in terms of just color and saturation and whatnot, it's probably not the best panel that you'll ever see, but I think it gets the job done. And the other advantages of having the high refresh rate and also that 4:3 aspect ratio, which scales nicely with 480p content, also is something not to be overlooked. The display also gets nice and bright. It's not going to win any awards, but I think it's good for outdoor gaming. When playing in the shade, I think that you can see just about everything, and even when in direct sunlight, I would still say that it's playable. So that's one of the advantages of this screen as well. I think this is a device that you could play outdoors. It also gets very dim at 0% brightness to the point where it's really hard to even see it in the first place, which means that it's going to be great for playing in the dark, and you'll be able to adjust it to whatever range depending on how dark it is as you're playing. In terms of audio, they are downfiring speakers, but I find them to still be very nice and clear and not muffled, which is often a concern when they are downfiring. Let me give you a quick listen. So really, I don't have any concerns about the price point. I think it sounds really good, and it gets very loud. This is playing at 75% volume. As far as software goes, it's all the same song and dance we've seen with Anbernic and other Android-based handhelds. So it's essentially just like a phone or a tablet that has, controls slapped onto it. So all you really have to do is just go into the Play Store, download your games and apps and whatnot, or get them from elsewhere, and then load it up with your ROMs, and then use a front end like Emulation Station to kind of put this all together. And in my testing here of setting this all up last night, I didn't run into any software issues beyond what I've just typically seen from Anbernic. And so yeah, I think this is going to work out pretty well. You can also swipe down from the top and make some adjustments here. For example, you can change the fan mode, or you can change out what they call auto or high mode. That's supposed to increase the overall performance, but I found that with this chipset, it doesn't really do much at all. You can also change out your ABXY control scheme, as well as whether or not you're going to have analog or digital triggers. But one thing to note about this chipset as well in Anbernic software is that it will not persist through a reset. So if you put this in Xbox mode and you turn the device off and turn it back on, it's going to automatically switch over to the Nintendo Switch mode. That's one annoying thing that's been happening for years at this point. It's kind of crazy that Anbernic still hasn't fixed it. If you go into the Android settings, there are some things worth noting. For example, in the display section, this is where you can go and adjust your refresh rate from 60 to 90 or 120 Hertz. Further down, there is a handheld game console settings option. So within here, you can make a lot of the same adjustments that you can do in the top-down menu, but this is where you can change out your quick launcher. So if I change this to be Emulation Station, what this means is that when I press and hold the RG button, it's going to go back and forth between that, and I think that's really handy. But for the most part, that's basically it when it comes to the software. I set it up the same way I set up any other Android handheld. I've got a starter guide I'll leave linked down below, but it really is just a matter of installing your emulators, loading up your ROMs, and then using a front end to make it all pretty. Now, like I've already said, this isn't going to be a final review, but I did do a bunch of game testing just to show you what it's going to look like on this device and this display. We'll start with the easy stuff and kind of work our way up and kind of discuss as we go through, and I'll get more into detail when we do that final review. When it comes to Game Boy and Game Boy Color, this is going to show black bars on the left and right because it is a 10:9 aspect ratio system. But because this display doesn't have any visible borders, it actually looks pretty nice. Game Boy Advance is pretty similar, but you're going to have black bars at the top and bottom because this is a wider aspect ratio than 4:3, but I think they're relatively minor. And thanks to the high resolution of this display, we've got a lot of pixels to work with. It's not a perfect integer scale, but it's 5.3x, so you could use a 5x integer scale if you would like. Personally, I think that once you get in that high of a pixel density, I don't really notice once it gets non-integer, so I'm just using it full screen like this. But where this device really shines is playing 4:3 content. Things like NES, Super Nintendo, Sega Genesis, all those classic systems had a 4:3 aspect ratio because that's the aspect ratio we had on those old school TVs. You can also pair it with a bunch of shaders and whatnot, but I will save that also for the final review just because I got a lot more testing before I can say definitively which ones are going to be the best for this particular chipset. But rest assured that all these games are going to look great either with a CRT shader or without. Most arcade games are going to run great too because those that had a horizontal orientation were generally 4:3, and so that's going to be a perfect match as well. And the T820 chipset here does do a pretty good job with basically all those old school arcade games. Everything up to Killer Instinct will play at full speed. Now moving on to 3D based systems, for these you can actually upscale them to 960p, and if you're playing a game that uses 3D polygons, something like Jumping Flash 2, it's going to upscale to match the display resolution and it looks awesome. And of course we got plenty of power to be able to play the entire PS1 catalog at that 960p upscale. Same thing with the Nintendo 64, every game that I threw at it ran at full speed even within RetroArch, so I didn't have to use Mupen Standalone or anything, and I was still able to play heavyweight games like Cruisin' USA at that 960p resolution upscale. For Dreamcast, it was a little bit more challenging, so I found that within RetroArch, I was getting some crackling and a little bit of slowdown too, and so instead I used Redream, which will also allow you to upscale to 960p, and everything worked really great here. So I think the whole Dreamcast catalog is going to be fine. It's just a matter of maybe picking standalone emulators as opposed to RetroArch just to get that performance advantage. For PSP, you are going to be limited by the fact that it's a 16:9 system, so you'll have larger black bars at the top and bottom, and also the resolution here only will upscale to 2.7x internally, which means that you can just set it to a 3x resolution upscale, and that's going to be just perfect for this display, and it's not going to be super demanding on the CPU either, so you'll be able to play every game like this. Even the heavyweight titles like God of War Chains of Olympus played perfectly fine at a 3x resolution upscale. The last classic retro system that I think is fully playable is going to be Sega Saturn, with some caveats. Number one, you're not going to be able to play with the Beetle Saturn core with every single game. That one's much more accurate, but it is more demanding. Instead, I found that playing with the Yabasan Shiro core makes just about every single game playable. So if you are really particular about getting perfect Sega Saturn gameplay, this is probably not a perfect match, much like other devices with the T820 chipset, but if you don't mind running them with a little bit of inaccuracy, you can still have a great time. I've spent a lot of time talking about GameCube and PS2 in my previous videos with the same chipset, and all those findings are the exact same. I found that GameCube always runs better than Wii and PS2, and you can often run these games at a 2x or at least a 1x resolution scale. Now this chipset does have a Mali GPU inside of it, which does not have the best compatibility, and so often I find that I have to use the OpenGL backend instead of Vulkan, which will reduce performance. And sometimes what that means is that in order to get the game to actually look proper, you have to drop it down to a 1x or native resolution upscale. So the way I usually will do it is I'll try it out in Vulkan 2x resolution upscale, but then if I'm getting graphical issues, then I'll have to drop it down to OpenGL, and often it won't play at full speed, and so then I'll have to drop it down to native resolution instead. For Nintendo Wii, it's a similar process, but I don't even try to do a 2x resolution upscale. Many of the times I just try just the native 1x, which I still think looks very good, and many Wii games have native 4:3 support, so it's going to fill up the screen nicely. Like I've shown in other videos, PlayStation 2 is a bit more hit and miss. There are plenty of games that you can play just fine, but generally, again, I stick to a native resolution and then upscale it if I can. Lighter weight games like Katamari Damacy, absolutely no problem here, and Ratchet & Clank will also play pretty well with some slowdowns here and there. When you start moving things up to like racing games or even stuff like God of War, often you will see some slowdown and you'll have to go into the settings and adjust them and maybe add some emulation hacks, but in general, I would say that PS2 is a system that's worth experimenting with, but I would not buy this device specifically to play PS2 games. In the end, I don't see that as being a wholly negative thing just because this overall design is D-pad centric, and so I think it is more retro game focused. It just so happens to be able to play a lot of PS2 games. So let's kind of put this all together and wrap up and talk about what I've seen that's good so far and some concerns that I have. We'll start with the good stuff first. Number one, the Anbernic RG476H kind of feels like a greatest hits compilation of all the other Anbernic devices that have come out before. We've got these tried and true controls with upgraded sticks with swappable caps, and it's all compiled together around this excellent display which they brought out here in 2025. And even though it doesn't feel like a very innovative handheld, it still just hits in all the right spots. It's got an excellent display, good controls, those stacked shoulder buttons that puts it all together in a very comfortable package. But of course it's not perfect, and I've already got a couple concerns in my first 24 hours. And number one is the fact that the front does get a little bit smudgy. I like that they're using an all-glass front. It kind of looks a little bit slick and premium, but it's also not nice that I've been constantly wiping it down to get rid of these smudgy fingerprints. So whether or not the smudges that you can see along here that just kind of naturally pick up are going to bother you is really just a matter of taste, and I think it'll be a lot more prominent on the black model, but even less so on the gray one. So if this bothers you, then one of the options would be to get a lighter color. Another thing to consider is that this is a D-pad centric setup, so having a dual analog grip like playing a first-person shooter game just naturally is not going to feel very good. There are are mitigations out there, like for example, I expect to see 3D printed grips in the future, which will enhance that overall gameplay experience, but as it stands right now, out of the box, it's not going to be great for that specific control scheme. For everything else, I think it's fine, but it is worth knowing what you're getting yourself into. And then also, like with all the other T820 chipset devices, it is worth repeating that GameCube and PS2 performance on this is not going to be as good as compared to like the Retroid Pocket 5. Again, I wouldn't necessarily consider this to be a GameCube and PS2 focused handheld in the first place, but the fact that you can play some games means that many people will likely want to play more games on it, so it's worth tempering your expectations or maybe shopping around for something else if those two systems are a priority for you. In the end, after just one day with this handheld, I'm feeling pretty positive about it. I think that there aren't any deal breakers here and nothing beyond what I already expected with this particular design and having a glass front and everything else. I've got some other things I want to test before the final review, like the cooling system and how that all works. We'll do some benchmarks, and then I also want to test like video out, and then we'll also talk more about shaders and what to expect with this chipset. So be on the lookout for that video in about a week or so, and then we'll kind of wrap it all together once we know that price and say whether or not I think this is going to be a good value. But so far, I'm pretty impressed. Let me know what you think in the comments down below. Are you just sick of all these Anbernic handhelds? Should they just slow down with their output, or are you looking forward to this one? As always, thank you for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe if you found this helpful, and we will see you next time. Happy gaming.